The Apache woman slept in my barn. By morning, she was in my bed. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wind started shifting at sundown, by the time the last of the daylight faded over the plains and the frost rolled in off the distant hills. Calderboone had already hauled the last of the firewood into the cabin and stoked the hearth to carry him through the night. The smoke from the chimney flattened against the wind and blew sideways. That meant bad weather was coming, fast, sharp, and not worth ignoring. Calder didn't like surprises. Not anymore. He stood by the window, arms crossed, looking past the reflection of his own tired face into the dark yard beyond. The barn stood about 40 yards away, hunched low under the weight of snow melt and storm season repairs. His father built that barn with nothing but raw lumber and a mule team back in '59. Calder had spent most of his life patching it up ever since. He was supposed to be getting some rest. It had been a long day of digging out fence posts and splitting frozen logs, but something about the silence outside unsettled him. The temperature dropped harder than it should have. There was moisture in the air. He felt it in his joints and in the ache beneath the old bullet scar near his ribs. Trouble was in the wind. He grabbed his coat, heavy wool with the collar gone stiff from years of sweat and weather, pulled on his boots without socks, grabbed the lantern from the nail near the door, and lit it from the hearth. The wind tried to suck the flame out as soon as he stepped outside, but he hunched over the glass and kept walking. The snow hadn't started yet, but it was coming. Rain first, then sleet, then something meaner before morning. The ground was already part frozen, slick with patches of mud where the last thaw hadn't dried. Calder's boots made thick sounds with every step. The wind cut through his coat. He didn't hurry. Rushing in the dark made mistakes, but he moved steady, scanning the yard, eyes narrowing as he got closer to the barn. Inside, the dark was softer, warmer. The smell of hay and horse sweat grounded him. Familiar. The horses stirred when he entered, their ears flicking toward the light. He set the lantern on a beam nail and made a slow circuit, checking the doors, the grain sacks, the feed buckets. Everything seemed in order, almost that he caught it in the edge of his vision, a change in the shape of the hay pile by the far wall. Not enough to be obvious, but something was off. He moved closer, quiet. No need to startle anything. The horses were calm, so whatever it was hadn't spooked them. When he rounded the stall corner and lifted the lantern higher, he saw her. At first, it didn't register. She was so still she almost looked like part of the haystack, except for the color of her skin and the way her fingers gripped the edge of a dirty blanket like a life rope. She wasn't sleeping. Her eyes were wide open, locked on him, unmoving, watching, breathing hard through her nose. Her hair was long, black, and tangled down across her shoulder. Her dress, what was left of it, was soaked through, torn at the collar and shoulder, ripped across the thigh. Her knees were pulled up toward her chest, her bare feet red with cold and caked mud, ankles scratched and bleeding. One shoulder had bruises blooming under the skin, and her lip was split. She'd been running. Through thorns, rocks, maybe worse, Apache. Calder could tell. Young, maybe mid-20s, maybe less. Hard to say through the dirt and exhaustion, but he didn't speak. Neither did she. He stepped back slowly, hands visible. No sudden moves. His mind went through options. She could be a runaway, maybe from a settler's homestead, maybe from something worse. He knew enough about what passed for justice in these parts to know she didn't land here without reason. And he also knew one thing with certainty. She was terrified. No bandit would have huddled into his barn barefoot, unarmed and bleeding. Not here to hurt you, Calder said flatly, voice low and measured. You're safe in here tonight. She didn't answer, didn't blink, just watched. Calder knelt by a crate, keeping distance, and pulled from his coat pocket a strip of venison jerky and half a piece of cornbread he'd meant to eat on the fence line earlier that day. He set it down on a cloth, unwrapped it, and stepped away. He didn't have much water on him, so he left the lantern burning where she could see it and slipped out into the storm again. He walked to the house, filled a tin canteen with water from the pot by the hearth, and returned. She hadn't moved when he came back. He left the canteen near the food, then stepped back toward the stalls. Sat on a bale of hay, silent. They stayed like that for several minutes. No words, just the wind outside, the rustle of hay, and the slow breathing of the horses, she eventually shifted. Picked up the bread first, then the meat. Ate slowly, cautiously, like she expected it to be taken away again. When she reached for the water, her hand trembled. She drank only a little, just enough to wet her mouth. Her eyes never left him. When she finished, she wrapped the blanket tighter and turned her back to him. That was the closest thing to trust he figured he'd get that night, that he didn't ask her name, didn't press. Instead, he stood quietly, grabbed the lantern, and left the barn door bolted only from the outside, not latched shut. He wasn't sure why. Back in the house, Calder took off his coat, stoked the fire, then sat at the table in the dark. He poured himself a cup of cold coffee and stared at it long while before drinking. Calder had run the ranch alone for nearly 6 years now, ever since his younger brother died in a horse fall and their father followed soon after from heart sickness and a bad winter. No wife, no kids, no family nearby. He didn't go into town much unless he needed supplies. The locals called him reclusive. He didn't mind that he wasn't hiding. He was tired. Calder had seen war, had ridden with a volunteer company back in the early 70s, saw things near the border he never spoke of. After that, he came back to work the same land he was born on, trying to make sense of a world that no longer did. The war was over. The land still needed tending. And now, a woman, half frozen and broken, in his barn that he didn't sleep that night. Not fully. Each gust of wind made him glance at the window. Each pop from the fire made him sit straighter. His rifle stayed near the door. Not because of her. Because of whom might come after her, did I in the morning, when the storm broke and the light crept across the plains, Calder dressed without sound and made his way to the barn. She was still there, but something had changed. She'd eaten all the food, drank the water. She'd swept part of the barn floor clean, stacking hay into a neater pile than he'd left. She was limping slightly, her leg still bleeding. The bruises on her shoulder looked worse in the daylight that he approached with a slow, even pace. Saw her shift to face him, cautious but not flinching. He nodded toward her leg. Needs cleaning. She didn't respond. That he walked to the corner where he kept the wash basin, filled it from the barrel, tore a strip of cloth from an old undershirt, and pulled out a small tin of salve he used on the horses when they'd get caught in barbed fence. Then he waited. Gave her space. Eventually, she sat on the rail near the stall, extended her leg. Her body stayed tense, her face unreadable. But she let him near. Calder worked without talking. He cleaned the wound, wiping away mud and old blood. She winced only once. The cut wasn't deep, but it was raw, likely infected if it had gone another day. He bandaged it tight, then stepped back. She looked at him briefly, eyes flicking up to meet his for the first time, then down again. Calder didn't press her, that he just said, "I'll bring food later," and turned to leave. She went back to sweeping. That night, he left the cabin door unlocked, just in case, but she didn't come in. Not yet. The second morning came with a brittle sky and frost on the windows. The storm had passed, but the air held that post-weather silence, the kind that made sound travel farther and made a man feel like he was being watched even when he wasn't. Calder Boone stood at the stove, frying bacon in a cast-iron pan, his jaw set, eyes distant. He wasn't hungry, hadn't slept more than an hour, but he cooked anyway. Routine helped. Kept thoughts from spiraling into places they didn't need to go. That he wrapped half the food in a clean rag, poured water into a tin cup, and stepped outside. His boots sank slightly in the thawing mud. The morning light stretched flat over the prairie, gray and sharp. A few crows picked at the remnants of wind-scattered debris near the fence line. Nothing out of the ordinary. That he walked to the barn with the same, even stride he always used, calm, measured, not giving away the fact that his stomach was tied in knots. She was still there. That he knew before he opened the door. The horses were alert, but not agitated. They knew her scent by now. She'd been quiet during the night, or maybe he was just too tired to hear. Inside, she was standing, not hiding. She'd pulled a horse blanket off a rail and wrapped it over her shoulders, and she was facing the stall, watching one of the Maras chew lazily at her feet. Calder stopped in the doorway, holding the food in one hand. "You eat?" She turned slightly. Didn't speak that he walked over to the same hay bale he'd sat on the day before and set the food and water down without saying anything else. He didn't push her. If she wanted to eat, she would. She had a survivor's instincts. That much was clear that he noticed she'd gathered more hay overnight. The tools he kept near the back wall, pitchfork, shovel, the rusted egg basket, had been organized. Nothing fancy, just placed where they belonged. Not by accident. She'd been working. He nodded toward her leg. You opened that cut again? She didn't answer. But when she took a step forward, her limp said enough. Calder didn't comment. He fetched the basin, added warm water from the bucket near the door, and knelt again. She approached slowly, cautious but deliberate. When she sat, he unwrapped the bandage. Her skin flinched slightly at the cold, but she didn't pull away. Looks cleaner, he muttered. You've had worse. She gave the faintest shrug. Not disrespect, just agreement. She had. He could tell that he cleaned the wound. Calder's thoughts circled the same questions he hadn't dared voice the night before. Where did she come from? Who had she been running from? And what in God's name had she risked to get here? She had no supplies. No horse. No coat. No shoes. No satchel. Not even a knife. That didn't happen by choice. That was someone escaping in the middle of the night with nothing but their breath in whatever direction looked most like freedom that he didn't ask yet. It wasn't time, but he did speak. You stay here, it's going to bring questions, he said, voice level. Folks see an Indian girl on a white man's land. They don't ask politely. They just assume things. Her eyes flicked up. Not scared, not angry, just alert. He saw something in her then. Intelligence. Caution. She was watching him closer now. I'm not looking to own anyone. You walk out that door, I won't chase you. But if you stay, you follow the rules. She stared. You work. You eat. You don't touch my rifle. And I don't lie for people. If someone comes asking, I'll listen first. But I won't get shot covering for something I don't understand. A beat passed. Then another. Finally, she nodded once that it wasn't obedience. It was negotiation. Her terms were silent, but he understood them. He dried the leg, wrapped it again, and stood. The next few days settled into a quiet rhythm. She didn't try to run. She didn't hide. And slowly, she started doing more. Feeding chickens, moving feed sacks, sweeping out the coop, even dragging buckets of water from the well despite her injury. She was quiet, precise. She didn't complain. But she worked. Every day she stayed. Calder knew the risk increased. She was unmistakably Apache. Her cheekbones, her hair, her skin. Her presence was a silent challenge to the kind of men who rode out from town with rope and assumptions. But Calder had made his choice the first night that if he'd been the kind of man to throw her back into the storm, he wouldn't have lit the lamp, wouldn't have brought food, wouldn't have cleaned the wound or spoken gently. She reminded him of something he didn't talk about, the part of his life before the ranch, when orders came from men with no names and punishments were handed out with torches. He'd seen what happened to women like her when they were caught. He still had the image of a girl's bare feet dangling from a telegraph pole in El Paso burned into his memory that he'd been younger then, dumber. And he hadn't stepped in. He wouldn't repeat that mistake. One evening, just before sunset, he found her standing behind the cabin. Not close, just standing still in the grass, watching the horizon, eyes narrowed. He'd been splitting kindling. Stopped when he noticed her. Expecting someone? He asked, wiping sweat from his brow. She didn't answer. Just kept looking west, where the land folded over itself like frozen waves and the sky bled pink and purple. Calder followed her gaze but didn't see anything. No riders. No smoke. Nothing moving but wind through the dry cottonwoods. You got someone chasing you? Still no answer, but her jaw clenched slightly. Her hands curled around the edge of the blanket she still wore, like a shield. Calder sighed. Not angry, just worn. If you won't talk, I can't help you more than this, he said. I've given you space. Time. But if someone dangerous is out there, someone who'd come all the way here for you, I need to know. She didn't flinch, didn't back away. Then, finally, she said something. Her voice was soft, hoarse, barely more than a whisper. No one's coming. That was all that he believed her. That night, after supper, she stood outside the cabin again. Same as before. Same distance. Same look of quiet uncertainty. Calder didn't say anything. He just left the cabin door unlocked. She didn't come in. Not yet. But she was thinking about it. The wind shifted again 2 days later. Colder. Coming down from the north. Calder didn't need a thermometer to know the first real snow was close. He could feel it in the way the air went still at sunrise, the way the ground crunched harder underfoot, and in the way the birds had gone quiet. He stood on the cabin porch that morning with his coffee, staring toward the barn. She was already awake. He'd seen her shadow move past the slats just after dawn. 3 nights had passed since she first showed up. She hadn't come inside the house yet, but she'd gotten closer each evening. That meant something, even if she never said it. Inside the barn, she was gathering feed in a tin pail, slowly, favoring her leg, but with a kind of quiet purpose. She worked without hesitation, didn't wait for instructions. Calder watched for a moment before walking over. "You know your way around animals?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Some," she said. Her voice was stronger than the first time. Less raw, still cautious, but firmer. Calder nodded. That explained why the horses hadn't panicked when she'd first come into the barn. She moved like someone who'd been around livestock before. Not soft, but deliberate. Measured steps. Gentle hands. He'd known full-grown men who couldn't walk into a stall without spooking a mare that he watched as she scooped grain into a trough, then set the pail down and backed away. The mare stepped forward and started eating. "You from around here?" he asked. No, that was it. She didn't offer more. Calder didn't press. It was still early. Not just in the day, in whatever fragile trust was forming between them. He wasn't going to crack it by demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. But something was shifting. She was no longer a guest hiding in the hay. She was beginning to act like someone who belonged. Not legally, not formally, but in the way she moved around the place. She was taking care of things that needed doing. Fixing broken latches, refilling water buckets. Calder had found the woodpile neatly res-tacked without a word. She even salted the last of the pour from the cellar barrel without being told that he hadn't asked her to stay. But she hadn't left either. And if he was being honest, he didn't want her to die. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't company. It was something harder to define, something like shared survival. Like two people working side by side, not out of choice, but out of necessity. And the more she contributed, the harder it was to imagine her gone. Later that afternoon, while patching the fence along the north line, Calder kept glancing toward the horizon. Not because he expected riders. Not really. But because he knew what men were capable of when they got scared, or bored, or self-righteous, that a rancher named Whit Halloran had gotten himself killed last spring for harboring a runaway girl. Not Apache, but close enough. The law hadn't punished him, but the town had turned their back. No one would trade with his wife afterward. Took months for the whole thing to blow over. Calder knew the risks. He'd weighed them. And still, every time he looked at her, the way she limped but didn't complain, the way she worked without asking for permission, he kept coming back to the same truth. She deserved the same shot at peace as anyone else. That evening, she brought in eggs from the coop. For brown ones, still warm from the nest. She handed them to him without a word, then stood by the door of the cabin, uncertain that he looked at her, then at the eggs. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then nodded that he stepped aside. "Come in, then." It was the first time she crossed the threshold. She didn't stop to look around, just went to the corner by the hearth and sat on the bench. She didn't touch anything, didn't lean back. Just waited. Calder cracked the eggs into the skillet, added a slice of bacon, and let the fire do its work. The room filled with the smell of grease and wood smoke. Familiar. Grounding that he put a tin plate in front of her. She picked up the fork slowly, then started eating, still no words. But the silence was different now, less like fear, more like space being shared that he sat across from her. "You got a name?" he asked at a long pause. Then, quietly, "Naya." He nodded once. Calder. They ate in silence. Afterward, she helped wash the tin plates without being asked. Then stood near the door, uncertain again. "You can sleep here tonight," Calder said. "Warmer than the barn." She didn't answer, but she stayed. When he laid out the extra blanket on the floor beside the stove, she lay down without a word. He took the bed and didn't argue about it. That night, he watched her by the firelight, eyes closed, breathing slow. Not broken, not helpless, just trying to survive, like him. The snow came in quiet, in a wind. No warning, just a silent shift in the air overnight that blanketed the prairie in a soft, white layer by dawn. Calder Boone opened the cabin door that morning and stood still for a moment, looking out across the land. Everything was covered. The roof of the barn, the chicken run, the corral fence line, smoothed over, hushed by the cold. The world looked paused. He glanced over his shoulder toward the hearth. Naya was still sleeping on the blanket near the fire, one arm tucked under her head, her hair fanned out behind her like a shadow across the floorboards. She hadn't made a sound all night. It had been 5 nights since she first appeared. 3 since she entered the cabin. This was her second night sleeping inside. Calder hadn't asked her to stay the first time. He'd offered. She'd accepted. No talk. No complications. But it had changed something. The cabin felt different now. He made coffee in silence. The smell woke her before the heat did. She sat up slowly, blinking toward the window, then toward him. She didn't speak, but she didn't flinch. Just pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and sat quietly as he handed her a tin cup. She took it with both hands, like it weighed more than it did. Sipped carefully. Her face didn't show much, but her shoulders relaxed just enough for him to notice that he set a pan of oats on the stove, cracked in what was left of the eggs. Snow came early, he said. Naya didn't answer at first. Then, softly, how long does it stay? Sometimes till March, Calder replied. Sometimes longer. She nodded, not surprised, not afraid, just taking the fact that whatever she had escaped from, it was behind her now, sealed off by snow and distance. If anyone had been chasing her, they wouldn't get far through that. Not without horses and gear. And Calder was damn sure no one out there knew she was here. Still, he didn't let his guard down. Not completely. He'd moved the rifle from the wall to a nail just beside the door. Every morning before checking the stock, he circled the cabin once. Eyes sharp. Footprints would show easy in this kind of weather, but there hadn't been any. Not even deer tracks, just hers. Barefoot prints from when she first arrived. He hadn't stepped on them, hadn't swept them away. He didn't want to forget what she'd come through to get here. After breakfast, she helped clean the dishes. She moved a little easier now. The leg was healing, the bruises fading. The way she carried herself had changed, still quiet, still guarded, but less like a fugitive. More like a guest learning her surroundings. You ever used a saw? He asked. Naya looked at him, surprised, then nodded once. Good, Calder said, handing her the smaller of the 2 bow saws from the wall. We need kindling stacked by the porch. 2 rows high. She took the saw without hesitation. Didn't ask how much. Didn't ask why. Just went outside and got to work. By noon. There were 2 neat stacks of fresh cut wood against the cabin wall. Her hands were red from the cold, raw where the saw handle had bit through her calluses, but she didn't complain. She came back inside, set the saw down gently, and stood by the stove until her fingers stopped shaking. Calder watched her out of the corner of his eye as he patched a tear in the saddlebag strap. There was something about her that made him remember things he hadn't let himself think about in years. His mother had been a quiet woman too, Comanche blood, raised in a mission school in New Mexico before she'd married his father. She never said much either, not in town, not at church, but she could read a room better than most men could read a map. She always said stillness was its own kind of language. You just had to be patient enough to understand it. He hadn't thought about his mother in a long time. Not since she passed during the cholera scare in '75, but something about Naya brought that silence back. Not the kind that fills a space with fear, the kind that fills it with presence. She wasn't trying to be unseen. She was trying to stay grounded. She didn't ask about his life. Didn't pry. But she noticed things. She folded the blankets tighter at night. Cleaned the hinges on the stove when she saw the rust. Repacked the kitchen shelf without saying a word. Organizing the jars of beans and dried apples by size. No fuss. No ego. Just quiet, deliberate motion. That night after supper, Calder poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. He sat by the fire, elbows on his knees, and finally said what had been sitting in his chest since the snow began. You staying through the winter? Naya looked at the fire, then at him. There was no fear in her eyes now, just a kind of resolve. If I can. He nodded. Then we'll need to stretch supplies. And I'll need help on the roof before more snow hits. I'll help, she said, in no hesitation. No question about whether she was welcome. No argument. Just a quiet fact. They didn't talk much after that. They sat for a while in the glow of the fire, the wind outside rattling the shutters just enough to remind them how far they were from anyone else. Before bed, Calder laid out the extra blanket again. Naya stood beside it for a long second. Then, without a word, she moved closer to the fire, took off the coat she'd been wearing during the day, and lay down again, closer to the hearth this time. Closer to him. He didn't move, didn't say anything, but he slept better that night than he had in years. The cold deepened by the end of the week. By sunrise, the snow had crusted over, hard enough to walk on. The sky stayed gray for 3 days straight, with no sign of thaw. Calder Boone knew what that meant. Winter was settling in for real. Every morning now was a routine built for efficiency. Wood fire first, coffee second, water hauled in buckets from the half-frozen well behind the barn. A fire in the stove wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a necessity. Same with hot meals. And extra layers. And watching the supply shelf like it was a clock ticking down, he'd counted it all twice. Beans, cornmeal, salt pork, dried apples, flour, lard, coffee. If he stretched it right and trapped some meat before the next storm, they could make it to February without dipping into emergency stores. But it would take help, which now he had. Naya had settled into the rhythm of the place without complaint. It was subtle, but Calder could feel it in the way she moved. She no longer hesitated to open the cabin door in the morning or cross the yard to the barn. She walked like someone who understood the land, not trying to own it, just respecting it enough not to waste it. That morning, she stood near the chopping block, sleeves rolled up, hat low over her eyes. Her breath puffed in clouds as she lined up a length of frozen wood and brought the axe down clean. Calder watched from the porch for a few seconds before heading toward her with a second stack in his arms. "You splitting clean," he said. "You done this before?" "Yes." That was all she said. But she didn't look away. He set the logs down and nodded. "Don't have to do it all at once." "I know." He waited a beat, then said, "I've seen men split worse." That earned him the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile. Not exactly, but close. They worked together until noon. The labor didn't leave much room for talk, which suited them both. Calder cleared eyes from the barn roof, while Naya gathered eggs and raked the chicken coop. They met again at the water barrel, shoulders brushing once as they passed. She didn't flinch. He didn't move away. Early afternoon, Calder brought down the coil of rope he used for hauling loads and handed one into her without a word. They had to patch the west fence before the next snowfall buried it completely. The ground was hard, but the post holes still needed clearing, and he didn't have time to do it alone. Naya didn't hesitate. She tied off her end, adjusted the knot once, and followed. They walked side by side for most of the way, boots crunching over the snow-crusted ground. Calder noticed she didn't ask questions about where they were going or how long the job would take. She just did what needed doing. When they reached the fence line, Calder drove the first post while she held it steady. They didn't talk except for the necessary hand signals: raise, lower, hold. She didn't tire quickly, though he could see the stiffness in her leg after a few hours. She never said a word about it. They worked for 3 hours, then sat in silence against a half-buried rock, splitting a biscuit and some dried meat. Calder watched the sky shift to a pale silver, the sun already dipping low. "You still planning to leave?" he asked suddenly. Naya blinked, took a sip from the canteen, then looked straight at him. "Are you asking me to?" "No," Calder said without pause. She nodded once, accepting that. Then went back to chewing. It was the first time they acknowledged what they were doing, building something together, even if neither of them had said it out loud yet. That night, Naya stepped inside the cabin without waiting to be invited. She took off her coat, hung it where his was, and sat at the table while he cooked. When he brought the plates over, she reached across and added salt to his without asking. He raised an eyebrow. "You've been watching me that close?" he asked. She didn't smile, but her voice had a trace of dry warmth. "You like more than you admit." That was the longest sentence she'd spoken yet. After dinner, they didn't sit on opposite sides of the room like before. Naya settled near the fire, close enough that their knees touched once when she shifted. Calder didn't move. He took out his pocket knife and started whittling a piece of pine. Nothing fancy, just keeping his hands busy. She watched for a while, then leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The fire crackled. The snow hissed gently against the shutters. Outside, the wind moved like something pacing the hills. I had a sister, Calder said quietly. Naya opened her eyes. Didn't speak. Just waited. Lived 2 years. Fever took her. After that, my mother didn't speak much. Said the land kept things like that. Naya said nothing. Just nodded once. Like she understood more than he'd said, that he didn't know why he shared that. Maybe because it was the first time it didn't hurt to say it. Maybe because she'd earned it. That night, she laid her blanket out again. But this time, she did it near the table, closer to where he slept. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't ask questions. There was still distance between them. Still silence. But it wasn't the kind that kept people apart. It was the kind that made space for something else. The morning broke hard that a deep cold had settled during the night, leaving the walls of the cabin creaking under frost. Calderboone woke before the sun, as he always did, but this time his breath hung in the air like smoke as he sat on the edge of the bed, pulling on his boots. The fire had burned low. He moved quickly to stoke it back up before the chill got into the walls. He looked down to where Naya had slept. She wasn't there. For a split second, his heart kicked up, not fear exactly, but a jolt of that old habit from before, the kind you earn from being alone too long. He stood, looked toward the door, and saw it was still latched from the inside. Then he noticed the small trail of footprints in the thin frost leading from her blanket toward the corner where the washtub sat. She was crouched there, sleeves rolled up, splashing cold water onto her face, breathing through the shock of it. A rag hung over the edge of the tub, already half wet. She was cleaning herself. Calder stood in place for a moment, unsure if he should interrupt. Then turned toward the stove again. By the time the fire caught and the room began to warm, Naya had wrapped a spare blanket around her shoulders and was standing near the table, drying her hands. Her skin looked flushed from the water, her knuckles red from scrubbing. Her hair, wet and combed back, revealed more of her face than he'd seen before. Sharper features, tired eyes, but focused. Alive. You'll freeze yourself doing that, Calder said quietly. She shrugged. Needed it. He nodded. He understood. Clean skin wasn't about comfort out here. It was about control, about reclaiming something after losing too much. They ate breakfast in silence. Beans and dried bread. Coffee black and strong. Afterward, Calder went to check the horses. We came back in. Naya was crouched by the hearth, rubbing her leg slowly. The bandage had slipped. Needs looking at? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, she nodded. He knelt beside her and reached for the bandage, fingers brushing her skin as he unwound it. The cut had reopened slightly, not bad, but raw from working too hard. There was a bit of swelling around the edges. Pushed it too far yesterday, he muttered. She didn't argue. Just sat still, letting him inspect it. He dipped a cloth into warm water, wrung it out, and began cleaning the wound gently. Her breathing changed, not shallow, not fearful, just tense. He glanced up. You all right? Yes, she said. Her voice was quiet but certain. He went back to work. As he cleaned, he noticed small things. The edge of a scar along her shin, half healed. A nick near her ankle. Old marks. This wasn't the first time she'd run. It might not even be the worst. But whatever she'd been through, she'd survived it by enduring, not by complaining. When he finished, he reached for the tin of salve, scooped a little onto his fingers, and began to apply it. Her thigh tensed beneath his hand, but she didn't pull away. The fire cracked. The only sound in the cabin for nearly a minute. Then her voice broke the silence. Why do you help me? Calder paused. He didn't look at her when he answered. Because no one helped my mother when she needed it. That hung in the air for a long time. Naya didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. He wrapped the bandage tighter this time, tied it off, and sat back. His knees cracked from crouching too long. You need to rest it a day or two, he said. I can still work. You don't need to prove anything to me. Naya looked at him then, really looked. Not just a glance. Her eyes lingered on his face like she was trying to figure out what kind of man he was. Not what he said, what he did when no one was watching. Duddy held her gaze. After a moment, she nodded. That day, they didn't do any heavy work. Calder mended tools while she sat by the fire with some of the torn saddlecloths, stitching them cleanly with a steady hand. That he offered her his mother's old sewing kit without comment. She accepted it without asking why he still had IT at 8 as evening came. The wind picked up again, brushing snow against the windows like fingers tapping from the outside. They ate a hot meal of boiled beans and root vegetables, then sat on either side of the fire. Calder cleaned his rifle. Naya sharpened a small knife he'd given her earlier in the week. The kind of blade a woman could carry without raising suspicion. Small, hidden, deadly in the right hands. Before bed, Calder laid out his usual extra blanket near the table, but Naya hesitated. She looked at him, not with fear, but with something else. A kind of question that didn't need words. He said nothing. She walked over, picked up the blanket, and laid it out beside the hearth instead, closer than before. She lay down on her side, facing the fire. Not away from him. Duddy didn't say anything, didn't move toward her. But something had shifted again, something important. The silence between them wasn't cold now. It was full of choices. Full of small, hard-earned trust. Full of things not yet spoken. The fire burned low that night. The kind of slow, steady glow that lasted without being fed. Just embers and soft orange flicker. Enough to keep the room warm but not bright. Calder sat in his usual chair, one hand resting on the rim of a tin cup gone cold with untouched coffee, his eyes drifting between the window and the hearth. Outside, the wind was a distant hush. No real storm yet. But it was coming. Across the room, Naya was lying near the fire, wrapped in her blanket, eyes open. She wasn't pretending to sleep. Not this time. She was watching the flames like they might tell her something she didn't already know. Calder had been quiet all day. Part of it was habit. Part of it was that he didn't want to ask anything that would make her pull away. Trust was fragile out here. Not just between people, but between moments. One wrong question, one wrong assumption, and everything could unravel. But this time, it was Naya who spoke first. Do you miss it? Her voice was soft but clear. No preamble, no lead-in. Just the question, suspended in the firelight. Calder looked over at her, surprised not by the question, but by the fact that she was asking anything at all. Miss what? He asked. The silence. The way it was before I came. He considered that. I thought I liked it, he said. But it was just the only thing I had. Naya nodded. She didn't smile, but something shifted in her posture, a little less tension around the shoulders, a little more stillness in her breathing. I've been quiet a long time, she said. I figured. She sat up slowly, drawing her knees under the blanket, the firelight casting soft shadows across her face. Her eyes looked tired but open. Not tired from work, but from carrying the weight of too much for too long. Calder leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Did someone hurt you? He asked, voice low. Not demanding. Just wanted to understand. Naya didn't look away, but she took her time before answering. Yes. He nodded. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to know. Not tonight. I'm not running anymore, she added. That made Calder's chest tighten a little. Not from fear, but from the quiet weight of that sentence. It wasn't just words. It was a choice. One that mattered. They sat like that for a while, the fire casting light between them. The space didn't feel like two people avoiding each other anymore. It felt like two people listening, not to sound, but to each other's presence. When Calder finally stood to throw another log on the fire, he moved slowly, not wanting to break the moment. He added wood, then adjusted the iron poker until the flames stirred back to life. As he turned back toward his bed, Naya stood as well. He paused. She walked over to where he stood, close enough to feel the heat of her through the cold air between them. She didn't say anything, didn't reach for him, but she looked up and met his eyes, and that was enough. Calder didn't move. Naya stepped closer. Just enough so their arms brushed. She waited. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. Maybe not since before the war, before the graves, before the silence. That he reached up and gently placed his coat around her shoulders. Her breath caught, not in fear, but in something quieter, something smaller. She closed her eyes just for a second, then opened them again. She stayed where she was. So did he. Then, in a quiet movement that felt more like a decision than a gesture, she leaned into him, her shoulder against his chest, her forehead against the fabric of his shirt. She didn't speak. He wrapped an arm around her without thinking. Just enough to hold her, not enough to keep her. There was no kiss, no firework of emotion. Just shared warmth in a room gone silent again, but not lonely. She stayed like that for several minutes. Eventually, without speaking, they moved toward the bed. He sat down on one side. She sat beside him, still wrapped in his coat, still choosing to stay. When he lay back, she followed. She rested beside him, not under him. Her head near his shoulder, one hand on his chest, fingers curled slightly into the fabric. The firelight flickered across the ceiling, painting shadows that danced but didn't intrude. Calder didn't reach for her. He didn't pull her in. He just stayed still, breathing slow, heart steady. She was here because she wanted to be. That meant everything. Morning, they were still there, wrapped in quiet, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in something that didn't need a name. Not yet, but it was real, and it had begun. The next morning came without words. Naya stirred slowly, her body still curled against Calder's chest, his arm resting around her without pressure. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire had burned down to a warm red glow, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional soft creak of the beams above. She sat up first, pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, looked down at him. He opened his eyes. There was no panic, no regret, just a long, still moment between them. Something had changed. That was clear, but it hadn't broken anything. It had settled something that had been waiting, not in desire, but in recognition. He sat up too, rubbed a hand over his face, and stretched his legs. Then stood. I'll make coffee. She nodded, quiet, still half in the blanket. Her eyes followed him, not wary, just present. Like she was finally seeing him not as a man who might be a danger, but as someone who'd already proven he wasn't. They didn't speak again until the pot had begun to boil. Then Naya asked, softly, "Have you always lived alone?" Calder didn't look at her right away. He poured 2 cups, handed her one, and finally said, "Not always." She waited. He sat across from her, stared into his cup. "My brother died 6 years ago, kicked by a stallion on the far side of the pasture. I buried him under the cottonwood near the fence line. After that, it was just me." Naya didn't speak, but her eyes shifted slightly, as if she knew exactly what that kind of loss felt like. "What about your mother?" she asked after a moment. "Half Comanche. She passed before the war. Fever. My father after. Same year." Naya looked at him for a long time, then said quietly, "Your land, it's peaceful." Calder nodded. "That's why I stayed." She held her cup close, fingers wrapped tight around it. Her eyes dropped to the fire again. Then, without being asked, she spoke. "My mother taught me how to gut a fish by the time I was 6. Said it was the only way to be sure I'd never starve." Her voice wasn't broken, just factual, like the memory was something solid. Something real she didn't have to be ashamed of. Calder didn't interrupt. She died during the summer burn. Soldiers came down the canyon looking for a raiding party. They didn't find them. Burned everything anyway. She didn't go on. She didn't have to. Calder sat forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm sorry." Naya gave a slight shake of her head. "That was years ago. I survived." But the silence afterwards said more than the words had. Calder knew that silence. He'd lived inside it for most of his adult life. That morning, they ate together without rushing. Afterward, Naya took the egg basket without being told and stepped out into the snow. Calder watched her from the porch. She moved like she belonged now. Not just here, but beside him. The chickens rustled at her presence, but didn't panic. They'd grown used to her steps, her touch. She whispered something as she worked, words he couldn't hear, maybe not even English. It sounded like comfort. They spent the day together in quiet tasks, cutting meat, checking the coop, clearing the barn roof of fresh snowfall. Calder showed her how to reline the chimney flue. Naya showed him how to twist strips of cloth into fire starters the way her mother had taught her. Both of them learning, both of them teaching, and later, by the fire, Naya took the knife Calder had given her and handed it back. He raised an eyebrow. Something wrong? She shook her head. No, I trust you now. Calder stared at the blade for a moment, then quietly placed it back in her hand. You keep it. No one said anything else for a while. The next night, she didn't wait for the fire to die down or for the room to go dark. She simply walked to the bed and lay down beside him in hesitation, in shame. Calder followed, pulling the blanket over them both. Their hands found each other in the dark. Not clinging, not searching, just resting. Together. Later, she whispered something into his chest. A name. He didn't understand the language. But he felt the weight of it, the tone, the sorrow, the way her voice caught, that he didn't ask what it meant. She had given him a piece of herself. That was enough. That'd be why the end of the week, the cabin wasn't Calder's anymore. It was theirs. The tools were cleaned and placed back where they belonged, but differently now. The shelves were neater. The floors swept more often. The silences were filled not with unease, but with attention. Every movement meant something. Every touch a small agreement. I'm still here. I'm not leaving. The land outside had gone hard and white, frozen under thick snow, but inside, something was warming, something steady, something they didn't have to name, not yet. The sky had been heavy for days, thick with the kind of gray that promised more snow. The storm held off, but the cold deepened, settling into the bones of the land. Calder Boone and Naya had fallen into a rhythm so steady that even the silence between them felt like part of the structure now, like the logs in the walls or the wind against the shutters. They shared everything. Chores, meals, warmth, sleep. But that peace was still a fragile thing. Not because of what was between them, but because of what still existed beyond the hills. And on the third morning of the second week of snow, that peace cracked. Calder had been outside checking the fence line after a hard wind. Naya was tending to the chickens in the back pen. It was cold but not unbearable, and there hadn't been any fresh snowfall in days, just the constant slow drift of ice melting off the barn roof. Then he saw them point 3 riders, far off, maybe half a mile, crossing the eastern ridge in a slow line. Not galloping, not even in a hurry, just passing, it seemed. But their silhouettes were wrong. They weren't hunters or ranch hands. Too upright in the saddle. Too clean. One had a hat too tall for a fieldman. The other 2 wore dark coats. No visible packs. No game, no tools. Just guns. Calder didn't wave. Didn't signal. He stepped off the trail and ducked behind the low rise near the tree line, eyes tracking the men until they disappeared behind the south bluff. His hands were steady, but his stomach twisted, not in panic, but in preparation. That he turned and walked fast back to the cabin, cutting through the trees, boots crunching hard against the frozen earth. When he stepped inside, Naya was already looking at him. She could read it on his face before he said a word. 3 riders, he said. East Ridge. Her expression didn't change much, but her breath caught. You know them? Calder asked. No, you sure? She nodded. But they're looking, not passing through. Yeah, Calder muttered. I figured. He walked to the corner, checked the rifle, then the sidearm. Both loaded, both ready. Naya stood by the stove, one hand still wrapped around the wooden spoon in the pot she'd been stirring before he came in. Do you want me to go? She asked. Her voice was even, but something hard sat beneath it. Not fear, not pleading. Calder turned and looked at her, really looked. No, he said. She watched him for a long time. If they ask, what do you say? I say I'm not hiding anyone. Which is true, he said. You're not hiding anymore. That made her eyes soften just a little. But still, they prepared. He took her outside and showed her the side trail that ran into the pine flats behind the barn, where the ground dipped and could cover tracks easier than open snow. Not an escape plan, just a precaution that he left the rifle inside, but kept the revolver close. Wore it openly when he went out to cut wood that afternoon. He didn't want to look like he was waiting for trouble, but he wanted anyone watching to know he wasn't unarmed. The riders didn't come back that day, but they left a mark. That night, after the chores were done and the lamps were low, Naya didn't lie near the fire. She walked to the bed without hesitation, her movements careful, her eyes focused. Calder stood at the stove for a long moment, watching her, feeling the weight of what she hadn't said. Then he followed, sitting beside her. She looked up at him. If they come, she said quietly, and if they bring others, they won't. But if they do, she continued, Don't let them take me. Her voice was clear, not begging, not even asking, just stating the one thing she couldn't bear. I won't, Calder said. She reached for his hand, he let her take it. That night, they didn't sleep much. They stayed close, breath and warmth shared under heavy blankets, body still, ears tuned to the wind outside. And in the silence, a new thought began to settle into Calder's mind. Not fear, not suspicion, but something sharper. What would he do? How far would he go to protect this? He hadn't asked for her to come here. He hadn't planned for any of it. But she was here, and what they'd built, however quiet and unfinished, was more real than anything he'd known in years. She wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't passing through. She was home. And now that he knew what that meant, he wasn't willing to give it up. Not to men with questions. Not to the past. Not to anyone. The riders came back on the fourth day. Not in a rush. Not with a posse. Just two this time. The tall one with the clean coat and the narrow-eyed man who rode a little too high in the saddle, like someone who'd never worked a real day in the dirt. They didn't come armed to threaten, but they didn't bother to hide their rifles, either. Calder saw them before they reached the gate. He didn't hide. He was standing in the open, coat on, revolver at his side, one hand resting on the fence rail. Naya wasn't in sight. She was inside, as they'd agreed, watching through the curtain. The lead rider tipped his hat as they pulled up. "Morning," he said. Calder nodded. "You're a long way from town." "Just riding through," the man said. "Name's Wade. I work with Judge Renshaw out of Laramie. We've been following a trail for a while. Heard you might have had a visitor." Calder's jaw stayed locked. "I don't keep guests. Just run the land." The second man glanced at the barn. "You see a woman come through here? Apache girl, early 20s. Said to be traveling west on foot. Maybe injured." Calder didn't blink. "You see any footprints in this snow?" Wade shifted in the saddle. "No one's accusing. Just asking. There's a bounty, not for capture," he added quickly, "but for information. Some folks want to know she's all right." Calder studied both men for a long moment. Then he said, "Folks who want to know someone's all right don't send riders in with rifles and bounties." The men exchanged a look. Wade cleared his throat. "Listen, Mr. Boone. There's a family back in Rock Hill. A preacher's family. Lost a son in a robbery near Red Fork. Apache girl was seen fleeing the scene. Town folks don't care about details. They just want someone to blame. So what's the truth?" Calder asked flatly. "Truth is," Wade said carefully, "that boy tried to take something that wasn't his. And the girl fought back." Calder's expression didn't change. Wade leaned slightly forward in the saddle. "Look, I don't care what happened. But I got men who'll keep riding these parts until they're sure she's not here." "She's not," Calder said. Wade gave a slow nod. "All right." He turned his horse without another word. The second man hesitated but followed. They didn't look back. Calder watched them go until they were gone over the ridge, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the trees. Then he exhaled. Not relief. Just finality. That he turned and walked back toward the cabin. Inside, Naya was standing near the table, still as stone. "They gone?" she asked. "Yes." She didn't ask what they'd said. She didn't have to. She walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, steady hands, no hesitation. Calder sat across from her, took the cup, drank. Then, finally, he asked, "It was true, wasn't it? What he said?" Naya nodded. "The preacher's son found me near the creek. Said he'd help. Then tried to take me back. Said I'd be his property soon enough. I ran. He followed. I had a blade. You killed him. I didn't wait to see." Calder nodded slowly, then said, "You were right not to wait." That was the end of it. No judgment. No fear. Just understanding. They spent the rest of the day as usual, chopping wood, checking traps, reinforcing the barn door ahead of another storm. But something had shifted. The shadow that had followed her into the barn all those weeks ago had finally broken. That night, she didn't wait for him to reach for her. She came to him. In words. No silence either. Just presence. They lay together not as fugitives, not as survivors, but as something steadier. Something chosen. By spring, the snow began to melt. The stream behind the barn ran strong again, and the air smelled of earth and grass. Naya planted herbs by the window. One she remembered from her childhood. Ones Calder had never heard of. She started carving bone tools for the kitchen. Calder built her a new shelf just for drying. They made new trips into town together. In '01 asked questions. Calder's word was enough. When folks noticed her, they looked once, then looked away. The land had its own rules. So did its people. By the time summer came, the chickens had doubled. The garden was thick with squash and potatoes, and Calder had added another bedroll. Not for guests, but for storage. There was only one bed now. Theirs. One night, while sitting on the porch, Naya reached for his hand. Calder glanced at her, his face lit by the last orange streaks of sun slipping behind the ridge. "You think we'll always be here?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "I ain't going anywhere." She nodded and smiled. Not the kind of smile people show to be polite. The kind that comes from knowing, finally, that there's nowhere left. Are you in? And no more hiding, and no more sleeping in barns. She was home, and so was he.